Hi everybody, welcome back, and if you are new here, welcome. My name is Gabby, and if you've never been here, never watched any of my videos, have no idea what I do here on my channel, I cover true crime cases, and all the cases that I cover are a little bit older. They're all basically 20 years or older, so if that's something that you might be interested in, maybe go down below, click that subscribe button, and also make sure to turn on the post notifications to be notified every time that I upload. So today, for the last video of Solve September, we go over a case that was just recently solved this year. A case that pretty much immediately reminded me of another case, the one of Nancy Benalik, we discussed this month, where the killer lived an extremely short distance away from the victim and was even interviewed at the beginning of the case, and police thought them to be completely innocent and have no involvement in the crime at all. A case that, again, like so many others recently, has been solved due to genetic genealogy. This is the solved case of Rita Curran. Rita Patricia Curran was born on June 21st of 1947 to parents Thomas Francis Curran and Mary Eleanor Curran in Brooklyn, New York. Rita was accompanied by two younger siblings, Mary and Thomas Jr., who were aptly named after their beloved parents. Despite being a New York native, her heart resided in her hometown of Milton, a charming little town nestled in Chittenden, Vermont, a place her family made a name for themselves in. Rita grew up in a close-knit Irish family of Catholic faith that were active members of St. Anne's Catholic Church. Her father had worked for IBM for years, and then her family went on to own a diner and some rental cabins on Arrowhead Mountain Lake. Rita would go on to graduate from Mount St. Mary Academy in the year of 1965 and then Trinity College in 1969. Rita was a shy, kind-hearted, and goal-oriented person. She possessed a rare nature that refused to breed animosity. For anything horrible to happen to her at the hands of another human, revenge would have never been the motive. During the summer of 1971, Rita had turned 24, and at this time she had just moved from her parents' home in Milton to Burlington, an area roughly 16 miles southwest. She was nervous but excited to be living for the first time in life away from the home that she knew so well. She had moved to Brooks Avenue in a 3-floor apartment with some roommates. This was a Victorian-style home that had been broken up into 3 different apartments. Her roommates consisted of Beverly Lamphere, who was also 24 years old, who was coincidentally born a day before Rita was, Carrie Duane, who was 19 years old, and Carrie's boyfriend, 23-year-old Paul Robinson. These were roommates that Rita didn't know too well. She just answered an ad in the newspaper and found the apartment that way. They all got along, but Rita did confide in her family that she didn't feel like she fit in with them too well and that she was planning on moving out soon because of that. Rita had her own set of friends that she spent time with and things that she was involved with in her spare time, so she wasn't really home much. She also spent a lot of time visiting her friends and family back in Milton. When she lived in Milton, she had worked as a 2nd grade teacher for 2 years, working with primarily children with special needs, but upon moving to Burlington, she decided to go back to school and take graduate courses at the University of Vermont. She was enrolled in a reading and language arts workshop for summer sessions at the college. As for a job at the time, she was working as a part-time maid at the Colonial Motor Inn, which was a motel not far from where she lived. Not a job she necessarily desired to do, but she was trying to make the extra money to afford her schooling. Rita was working hard and she had so many things that she was excited about in life, but that life would be tragically cut short in July of 1971. The date was July 19th of 1971. Rita had gone to work at the motel earlier and then later on went to practice for a barbershop quartet that she was a part of. After this, she headed home, and it seemed like Rita had a busy day and simply wanted to stay in for the night because she had been invited to go to dinner with her roommates and she declined the offer. Beverly, Carrie, and Paul spent the night at a restaurant called Harbor Hideaway, having no idea what occurred while they were away from their Brooks Avenue apartment. Carrie and Paul arrived back at the apartment around 12:30 in the morning. Beverly, she stayed out a little bit longer and then got home sometime after they did. When they all got home, they did not immediately head to bed, and at this time they thought Rita was asleep in hers, but they spent a little bit of time in the living room just chatting. There were 2 bedrooms in the bottom floor apartment that they all rented. Beverly and Rita shared a room, and Carrie and Paul shared the other one. The door to Beverly and Rita's room had been left open, but they didn't think too much of this at the time. They just kept their voices down while they were talking in the living room. At 1:20 in the morning, everyone decided it was time to get to sleep. Beverly makes her way to her and Rita's room. Beverly walks in and she finds Rita on the floor, badly beaten. Rita had been wearing a blue lace nightgown and a housecoat. The housecoat had been ripped so fiercely that buttons had popped off of it, and her nightgown had been ripped down the front. Her underwear also ripped off of her body. A blanket from her bed was wrapped around her left leg. She had curlers in her hair, and during the attack, many of these curlers had been ripped from her head and were sprawled around the room. Beverly screams for the other roommates to come to her room. Carrie and Paul come in as fast as they can. Paul checks Rita's pulse, and there is none. They call the hospital and explain the situation to the operator, and he connects them with the fire department, who then sends over Burlington Rescue Squad members Steve Olio and Dave Bean. Steve and Dave quickly realize that they are not the ones who need to handle this situation. They are in the middle of a crime scene. So they notify the Burlington Police Department that there has just been a murder. Rita had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and ultimately her life was taken as a result of asphyxiation. She had been strangled to death with someone's own hands, and Dr. Lawrence Harris, Vermont's chief medical examiner, would verify that the beating was done by a man's fists and that Rita fought back with all of her might. There was definitely signs of an immense struggle. Rita had done everything she could in an attempt to save her life that night. A life that was believed to be taken from her around midnight, considering her roommates left around 11:15 p.m. and got home about a half an hour after 12 in the morning. Rita's murder shocked the area and left her loved ones in a state of just disbelief. Chittenden County State's Attorney Patrick J. Leahy stated that the slaying was one of the most brutal he had ever seen. Police went through the apartment and collected anything they thought had any connection to the case. One of those items being a cigarette. A single Lark brand cigarette butt found right near Rita's arm. And this would be what eventually helped solve her case. Other than the cigarette butt, police also found blood on the door between the kitchen and shed. The back door of the apartment and the front door had been left unlocked, and this gave police a clue as to which direction the killer had fled the apartment in. The main thing they were wondering at this time, though, was what was the motive? The killer had left the $20 bill Rita had in her purse, and all other items were untouched in the apartment, so it didn't seem like robbery was the motive. But considering poor Rita had been sexually assaulted, it seems like that was the motive. Rita's funeral was held on the Friday after her murder in her hometown of Milton, Vermont, at St. Anne's Church. In attendance were authorities working on her case and over 300 family, friends, and those who simply wanted to pay their respects to the young woman who lost her life in such a horrific way. At this time, Burlington Chief of Detectives Richard Beaulieu reported that his department had been inundated with calls from all sorts of people who claimed that they might have valuable information regarding the case. Only in a few days after what happened, more than 100 people had been questioned and about 3 people had been given polygraph tests. Of course, some of the first people questioned were people who lived extremely close to Rita, especially anyone who lived in the 3-story apartment building at the time. Rita and her roommates lived on the bottom floor, which was 17 Brooks Avenue. Then there was the middle apartment, and above that was 15 Brooks Avenue. Living at 15 Brooks Avenue was a man named William DeRoos and his wife, Michelle DeRoos. The couple had only been married for about 2 weeks at the time of Rita's murder. They were questioned about 3 times in total, and their story always remained the same. They stated that they were home all night. Neither of them left the apartment at any time that night, and they heard nothing. They didn't hear a commotion of any sort, and they heard no screaming. Considering Rita put up such a fight, it's odd that they said they didn't hear anything that night. They were just 2 people questioned out of hundreds, and they didn't really stick out to authorities, so authorities moved on from them and questioned others. Now, I was curious if the people in the middle apartment were questioned, which were on the 2nd floor, and one source of mine, which came from Reddit, it was a Reddit post that did a very extensive write-up of this case, they stated that police officer Richard Garrow on the night of the murder was unable to get anyone to answer, but if people lived in that apartment, I'm sure they were eventually questioned at some time. I personally could not find that information though. Through the years, there would be 14 suspects in this case, men that they kept going back to. For many years, one of those suspects was serial killer Ted Bundy, who was arrested in 1978, 7 years after Rita's murder. It was retired FBI agent John Bassett who proposed Bundy as a suspect in Rita's case. Rita's sister even wrote a telegram to Florida's death row where Bundy was being held to ask him directly if he had any involvement in her sister's murder. The FBI actually responded to her, informing her that Bundy at the time would not verify or deny his involvement. Ted Bundy had been born in Burlington, Vermont in 1946, and while behind bars, he told Detective Robert D. Keppel that he took the life of a woman in Burlington in 1971 while he was there collecting information regarding his birth. So it was really unknown for a period of time whether he was Rita's killer or not. But the day before his execution in late January of 1989, he told FBI Special Agent William Hagmaier that he had no involvement in Rita Curran's murder. DNA technology would eventually prove that to be true. As time went on, detectives kept working on Rita's case, questioning people and following almost every lead that came into the department. Like with so many cases, it just took time. It took technology advancing, and when DNA testing became more widely used in criminal investigations, investigators truly believed they may get somewhere in this case, considering there was DNA left behind at the crime scene, specifically that cigarette butt. In September of 2014, former detective Jeff Beerworth was working the case, and at this time, he decided to take a crack at using DNA technology to hopefully solve it. He sent the cigarette butt scrapings from under Rita's fingernails and vaginal slides they had from her autopsy over to the New York City office of the chief medical examiner for DNA testing. From that, they were able to create a DNA profile of a man, the killer, from the DNA from the cigarette. This was a huge step in the right direction for the solving of Rita Curran's case. In early May of 2016, Detective Beerworth received a report back that stated that half of the 8 slides that had been sent over to be tested contained an insufficient DNA concentration for any testing to be done. As for the fingernail scrapings, they were not examined. I'm not entirely sure why. They then uploaded that DNA into multiple databases for criminals, primarily CODIS, or the Combined DNA Index System, which is the United States National DNA Database created and maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It is a computer software program that operates local, state, and national databases of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, unsolved crime scene evidence, and missing persons. Unfortunately, though, there was not a match. The next major series of events would begin 5 years later. In 2019, a new team of detectives took over the case, with Detective Lieutenant James Treeb's main goal as treating Rita's case as if it just happened. He wanted a new set of eyes and to take a fresh look at all of the police reports, interview notes, and evidence. At this time, they also decided to pursue the method of genetic genealogy, which is taking DNA and uploading it into public genetic databases in the hopes to locate familial DNA and pinpoint who the person is, while sometimes having to map out an entire family tree to do so. If they think they found their person from there, they will compare the DNA directly to this person, if this person is still alive and they can locate them. Or they will reach out to family members of them and try to compare the DNA that way. And hopefully family is extremely helpful and will offer up their DNA to test against it so they can eventually solve the case or cross that family member off of the suspect list. With this case, they kept a lot of evidence from the crime scene in storage. And because the process of DNA testing is quite expensive, they thoroughly thought out what they were going to send over to be examined further for DNA. They separated some of the items into 2 categories. The first being items more likely to contain DNA, and the second being items less likely to contain DNA. In the first collection of items, it included 2 cloth drawstrings from the house coat of hers, a piece of linoleum with blood smears on it, Rita's underwear, part of her nightgown, the house coat itself, and 2 pieces of wood. The second collection included hair curlers and the bedding. In 2022, last year, they were all sent over to DNA Labs International in Florida, the same laboratory that handled the DNA from the cigarette butt. Most of these items, when tested, primarily contained Rita's DNA, except the cigarette butt and an item of clothing of hers that mostly contained her DNA, but also someone else's, and that was her house coat. They would find that this house coat, from my findings, that had been ripped, had the killer's DNA on it, but it was really the cigarette butt that solidified everything. In March of 2022, the actual cigarette butt was sent over to Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon Nanolabs is a Virginia-based company that became more known for providing DNA phenotyping, which is taking DNA and creating a virtual photo of what the person may have looked like at the time that they committed the crime. They will also create virtual photos of what the person may look like later in life to see what they may look like now if they're still alive. This has been extremely helpful in so many cold cases. They also are experts in the field of genetic genealogy. They took DNA from the cigarette butt, and that DNA was successfully sequenced, and they entered that DNA into family tree DNA and GEDmatch, both genetic databases. In August of 2022, Parabon Nanolabs asked the task force working on the case to send over a list of their suspects so they could look at their family trees and see if that family tree of the different suspects had any connection to the killer's DNA that they had from the cigarette butt. Detective Trebe insisted they needed to add Rita's upstairs neighbor, William DeRuse, to the list of names that they send over, so they did. William was added to the list, and Parabon got back with them sometime later and informed them that his DNA was a strong match on both his maternal and paternal side. They were eventually able to get in contact with William's half-brother, who offered up DNA to test directly to the DNA they had from the killer that was believed to be William, and it showed a relation. They were unable to test the DNA they had directly to William, though, because he passed away. So after 5 decades, thanks to a cigarette butt, they were able to finally solve Rita Curran's case. William DeRuse was 31 years old in 1971. He and his wife Michelle had married on July 5th of 1971, and they had met at a Zen center in San Francisco in 1970. During an interview recently, she stated that her parents were not too thrilled about her being with him, and the couple had moved into the Brooks Avenue apartment in spring of that year. He didn't seem like someone that her parents really wanted their daughter marrying. He just didn't seem like a great guy. William seemed a bit controlling. He didn't want her to work. He wanted her to stay at home with their future kids. And his ultimate dream in life was to eventually own a barber shop. Michelle stated that she knew that he had a criminal record, and on the night of Rita's murder, she and William got into a huge argument. And after the argument, he stepped out of the home to cool off for a bit. He was gone for a little bit of time and then returned. Michelle stated that she doesn't remember what he wore that night, but she remembers going to bed next to him later on in the night after he came back. She said that the next morning, he told her to not mention to authorities that he left the night before because he had previous run-ins with the law and they might suspect him of having some involvement in the crime because of that. So she listened to him and lied to authorities, saying that he never left that night. She told authorities recently that she would have never covered for him if she knew that he had been the one to take Rita's life. When she had been originally shown a photo of Rita, she didn't recognize her. They had no previous interactions, and roommates of Rita stated that Rita did not know William. It seemed like he stepped away from his apartment that night and saw a disgusting opportunity to take advantage of Rita and eventually kill her, and he took it. We do not know if killing Rita was William's intention that night. We don't know if he had his eyes on Rita for some time. We don't know what went on in his head. We don't know if anything went on in his head. Michelle claimed that the thought that he could have done it had crossed her mind at a few different points, but she never asked him directly, and she convinced herself he would have never done such a thing. Michelle told authorities that she did remember that he smoked cigarettes, but she was unsure what brand he smoked, if they were Lark or not. Now, only a few months after the murder though, in fall of 1971, William left Burlington and he moved to Thailand where he became a monk. Michelle didn't go with him at this time, even though they were still married. She moved there the following March. At this time, he was a monk. Then he lost his status as a monk. They traveled around a bit. Then he became a monk again, and she became a nun, and the relationship ended because you can't be a nun and a monk in a relationship. It's just against the rules. Michelle said that the relationship was not abusive, and he did not do drugs at the time, but it seems like that would quickly change. Michelle, based on records, was his second wife, but it would be his third wife, who he married in November of 1974 in San Francisco, who would tell a very different story. She stated that on one incident, he stabbed one of their friends for no apparent reason. The friend thankfully lived and William was arrested, but he just out of nowhere stabbed one of their mutual friends. After he got out of jail, he acted as if he didn't really remember the incident, and he asked her if he had stabbed her, and she told him no, that he stabbed one of their friends. Sometime later, he would choke her randomly during dinner, so intensely that she lost consciousness. We are not here to judge somebody on why they stayed in a relationship like this. Sometimes it is out of fear, but they had a very toxic relationship, and it was one where she did a lot of forgiving because she really did care for him. The relationship eventually ended in 1978 when she found out that he had been cheating on her. She moved on and was living with a new significant other sometime later, and William randomly showed up, very confrontational, but left before violence ensued, and that was the last time that she ever saw him. She stated that she does remember that during their relationship, at different points, he had been using very hard drugs and drinking heavily. I wanted to highlight this information because his second wife and his third wife paint a completely different picture of the same individual. Could the horrific thing that he did to Rita eat away at him over time? Is that what caused him to eventually downward spiral? We don't know, but he had a drastic change in personality soon after it happened. The focus is, of course, not on him, but this was a man who got away with what he did until the day that he died, which was from a drug overdose, acute morphine poisoning, in a hotel room in San Francisco on August 7th of 1986 at the age of 46. William DeRoos will unfortunately never stand trial and have to sit behind bars for what he did. Legal justice will never be served in this case, but Rita's family, after 5 decades, has some bit of closure. Mary, Rita's sister, at the press conference for the case stated, "This is our case and this is our sister, and she is always with us." Former Senator Patrick Leahy, in an interview after the conference, stated, "They weren't going to bring Rita Curran back, but they could at least bring closure. And after 50 years, they did." So that is the case of Rita Curran, one that again was solved after a little over half a century. I feel like quite a few of the cases that I covered this month, it took about 50 years for them to be solved. Most as a result of genetic genealogy. And I know that some people have their negative opinions about genetic genealogy, claiming that it's an invasion of privacy. But for me, personally, if my DNA is used to give some sort of closure to a family that's been grieving for decades and decades, go ahead. But leave any of your thoughts or opinions about this case down below in the comments. And of course, like always, leave some kind words down there as well for the loved ones of who today's video revolves around. This month was Solved September. Next month, we have Oldies October. We're just covering really old cases. So if there are any really vintage cases that you want me to possibly cover during the month of October, make sure to send those over to gabulosiscaserequests@gmail.com. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you for taking a little bit of time out of that day to listen to today's case. Stay safe, and I will see you all in the next one.